in the Romans chapter 8 verse 29, it says, ever since that time, the creation was subject to frustration. At times, suffering is inevitable consequences of breaking God's law, but not all sufferings are direct result of the God's breaking the God's law. It is important to note that not all suffering is the direct result of own sin. Sometimes other person may be responsible for because of your suffering. Let me give you the example of Job. Job, if we read Job chapter 1, there we find the character of the Job. Job was a God-fearing, upright and blameless person, yet he suffered greatly. His three friends thought Job's suffering must be the result of his sin, but Job protested his innocence. In his frustration with the situation, when someone is suffer, he is frustrated, and during that moment, many people, friends, and comes and give many suggestions and advices. In the same manner, Job's three friends give him many suggestions. In his frustration with the situation, he goes on so far as to accuse God of being unfair and unjust. However, Job's fourth friend, his name is Elihu, does not see Job's suffering as a result of the consequence of past sin, but he sees this Job's suffering as a God's way of drawing Job closer to him and teaching him about himself. However, he reforms Job for accusing injustice and urges him to recognize that all that God does is of His grace and mercy. Our God is a gracious and a merciful God, and He is slow to anger. He is a compassionate God. So in this way, the Elihu prepares Job for God's response, which speaks of His sovereignty. Our God is a sovereign God. He is the omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient God. It talks of His creative power. So my dear friends, we need to be very careful about making judgment about why others are suffering. Sometimes instead of comforting the person, we discourage by making the false judgment. We are quick in judging the person when someone is suffering, and we make a lot of points on that. Let Elihu be our model while comforting a person. We should be sensitive when we are comforting someone who is suffering. But in that moment, we should be sensitive, as I have said, but we should be careful, but we should always speak the truth. Let me give you quick points, God's work through the suffering. The number one point that I want to tell you is that suffering is used by God to draw us to Christ, draw closer to Him. The second point, God uses suffering to bring us to Christian maturity. If we read Hebrew chapter 12, the writer of the Hebrew says that our fathers discipline us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplined us for our good, that He may share in His holiness. He points out that discipline seems sometimes pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by God. God uses suffering to build our characters. Even Jesus learned obedience from what He had suffered. Hebrew chapter 5 verse 8 and 9 if we read, and He became the source of our eternal salvation for all who obey Him. God uses suffering to bring us to Christian maturity. Even Jesus learned obedience from what He suffered. Point number 3, I want to tell you is that God uses suffering to make our lives more fruitful. So if we read John chapter 15, there it said, I am the vine and you are the branches. If you remain in me, I will remain in you, and you have to bear fruit. And God prunes. The pruning process is not an easy thing, but it is a painful sometimes. But why God prunes us? In order to bear more fruits. So this is very important. Another quick point that let me tell you, the point number 4 is God uses suffering to demonstrate His work. If we read John chapter 9, there we find Jesus healed the man born blind. So this is one way of the God's way to demonstrate His power. Sometimes it's your suffer maybe because of the plan of God, and God wants to demonstrate His grace and His power through your suffering. And the final point that I want to make is that God uses suffering to bring about His good purpose. Let me give you the example of Joseph in the Genesis. Joseph, son of Jacob, was rejected by his own brothers, and he was separated from his father Jacob for how many years? 20 years. He was sold as a slave and forcibly removed to Egypt. He was unjustly imprisoned for a crime that he did not commit. For 13 years, he faced trials, temptation and testing. Yet God rewarded his disappointment as appointment. In the place of Pharaoh, a position next to king, because of his integrity. Towards the end of his life, he could save his family and the nations. So this is the God's plan to use Joseph to save his people. My dear friends, let's remember this point. Great faith is the product of great fights. Faith is the assurance and the conviction that we can face anything that does or does not happen to us and still go on living by that faith. While things get out of order, that faith becomes essential for our survival. One of the scholars says, great testimonies are the outcome of great tests. Great triumphs can only come after great trials. God sent faith to send reliefs, send problem to send solutions, send distress to send peace of mind. While things go on wrong, at least I know God still loves me. God is involved in our suffering. When we suffer, He suffers with us. God is the God who suffers alongside with us. We are not alone in our pain, although you are facing a problem, suffering, but we are not alone. Remember this point. There will be no suffering when God creates a new heaven and new earth in the second coming. There will be no more crying, no more weeping. If we read Revelation chapter 21, that suffering is inevitable in this earth because men are mortal, but our God is immortal. We may die of coronavirus or cancer or liver disease, heart disease, etc. But our God lives forever. Our God is greater than our problem. When He comes, He will resurrect us with glorious body. We will be with Him for eternity. This is the assurance of God. May God bless you through the hearing and listening of His word.